Thank you. And welcome, friends, to the start. It's always appropriate to start a dialogue with a dialogue. And who better than Ambassador here, whose experience I think everyone in this hall is familiar with. You've been at the epicenter of more conflicts than we might want to count. But I would like to begin with recalling something that Ambassador said to me before the last American election. That was the last time we had a chat. Right. And he did say, confounding conventional wisdom at the time, if I recall correctly, that do not rule out a Trump victory. And for us, now that a year has passed, I mean, we're getting to actually a year since the oath, what would you, as a Republican also, what would you describe as the framework, as the strategic framework of the Trump foreign policy and the tactical uses or interventions that he makes? Let me actually quote to you something which he said overnight, which would be very relevant to us, which is that that his intervention in America's South Asia policy is delivering results faster than anyone imagines. I'll just leave it at that. And
well, first, it's a great pleasure to be back in India, and it's a great honor to be having this conversation with you. I think the Trump administration has a few big ideas that has guided the administration during this turbulent times around the world, and also compulsions inside the United States. One distinct point of emphasis of this administration has been to re-emphasize sovereignty, global, of the not only for the United States, but to emphasize that the world is made of sovereign states, and that while globalization is a fact, there are limits to globalization, and there are downsides to globalization. This is a worldview that sovereignty is very important. Two, that the U.S. has to be attentive to its own problems, particularly the underpinnings of U.S. power need to be attended to. And those, in particular, were the U.S. military power in the aftermath of protracted wars and budget constraints, limitations imposed on expenditure for the military, that needs to be attended to. Peace through strength is a concept that the participant in the administration's decision-making very much embraced. And third, related, is to be attentive to U.S. economic power. That there have been slow growth for a long time. Costs of social expenditure have been going up, and that the combination of slow growth and expanding expenditure potentially leads to to a problem that there may not be enough resources to do all that the United States should do. And in terms of the world, the last point, I'm sure we'll get into more detail, there have been distinct emphases, we know with regard to this region in particular, a much more building up on what has happened before, a greater willingness to partner with India, to call a spade with regard to Pakistan and its state sponsorship of terror, the difficulties it is creating in Afghanistan and here, rebuild alliances in the Middle East, focus sharply on the problem of terror, and seek what I would call a combination of both engagement and containment, engage, I like to call it, China and Russia. I think that has been broadly the concept. I'm sure there's a lot of details that I have missed, but those would be the concepts broadly that the administration as a whole is committed to, although different institutions, different personalities might emphasize different elements.
Points well taken. The concept of sovereignty, at least as far as I am concerned, is absolutely critical to our understanding of the world. Mm-hmm. I mean, we are living in a very, very different kind of world, a world that began to emerge roughly 100 years ago with the rise of the nation state.
Right.
Basically, till 1918, the number of nation states or empires or whatever formations that existed was around 60. Today we have 200. Nearly 200 nation states. And the nation state itself is the essential quality of a nation state is sovereignty. Mm-hmm. Now this doesn't mean that all nations have the same capacities. Obviously they don't. But they all have equal rights and indeed equal obligations. You mentioned the role of the budget in the nature of war. I think wars are actually above budgets. Mm-hmm. That's what history tells us. And I won't dwell too much on the fact that we're still waiting for Britain to repay us for what it took from India during the world wars. But the nature of war itself has actually changed. And that is perhaps the most critical fact, both the nature as well as the objectives. War is no longer being declared by nation states or by nations officially. I mean, there's no official declaration of war. And yet there is more conflict raging across the contemporary world than would fill all the television stations and the newspapers together. And the origin is the transfer of war towards the total warfare, which is what. But what I believe, because you link the two as well, which is making terrorism center stage, we really need to understand what terrorism is all about. I think we sometimes have a naive view of terrorism, that it is only an extension of maverick, barbaric behavior patterns. I would submit to you, for your consideration, that the most serious terrorism comes from those who have very, very well-defined political objectives. And the first and most important of these objectives is that they do not believe in the nation state. The modern world, the architecture of stability today, the building block of that architecture is the nation state. And these are forces which do not believe in the nation state. And therefore, Daesh, for example, cannot understand why Syrian space and Iraqi space should be different. Boko Haram doesn't understand why the various countries of Africa should be different space. And indeed, the terrorists who are based in Pakistan do not understand why there should be any difference in the strategic, or there should be any ambiguity between you come from Afghanistan and Pakistan. And nation states are being defined or redefined as Islamic space or faith-based space. And that really challenges the stability of the world. And the second great challenge to the stability of the world is the use of a poison called fear to destabilize plural societies. And you can see the impact of violence and the use of fear, particularly upon democratic nations and so on. You've seen it in the experience. So how do we now tackle these challenges, which are almost existential challenges to those who believe in civilization?
Well, you've stated it very well, Mr. Minister. I believe that in part of the world, the situation is almost pre-Westphalia, where, as you mentioned, the concept of nation-state behaving based on their interest with some rules is not yet embraced and has not been institutionalized. And there is nostalgia for actual or imaginary periods in the past.
Yeah, which, sorry, but once defined it as the romance of regression.
Yes, as you've mentioned it in other forum, it is a very clear force. And in particular, you see this in the area where Muslim majority states are in existence. And this combines itself with the struggle between modernity and nostalgia, so to speak, and a return to an order and perhaps embracing Islamism politically as well. I have to say that I'm a little encouraged by the developments in recent times. And for example, in Saudi Arabia, the reform effort to embrace modernity, to make a different choice than perhaps the choices was made. And in the struggles in Iran that we have seen some manifestations of recently, also there is a potential. But I think it behooves us all that are affected by this, to the extent that we can, to encourage the creation of a more Westphalia nation state and the embracing of modernization as a long-term effort, and encourage the positive elements that one sees, while the negative elements are obviously one has to fight, especially terrorism, and hedge against. But also, on the other side, there is the Westphalia Plus, that also is part of the complexity of the world. So I would say Westphalia Minus is a problem. Westphalia Plus has its own challenges and complexities, that we don't lose sight of the sovereignty and the relationships and pursuing of interests based on that.
Well, Westphalia Plus can be defined. You can define it as European Union.
Right.
For example.
Yeah.
But for me, Westphalia Plus is something I think equally important, which is that Westphalia basically is a creation of an era of monarchies.
Right.
And today's nation state is a republican in spirit. That means driven by the will of the people. Right. It has often been said that nationalism began with the first battle after the French Revolution, right, by France, when a general facing far superior Prussian forces said that in the name of the people, right, not in the name of the king, and
Right.
they spurred their soldiers to eventually to victory and a series of victories. But the spirit that today's nation state has been created by the will of the people is a critical fact. And this is that today's legitimacy does not come from the divine right of kings. It comes from a very public right of people. This changes the nature of the engagement because it creates problems and creates solutions, like almost everything in life. And the will of the people then, as expressed through demos, is what tends to drive policy forward. So you can see the pluses and minuses of this. And I think what we do actually underestimate, and this I find definitely a problem in some of the discourse we hear even from Europe and so on, is that we need to find a practical answer to terrorism. What is the ideological? We can't just win the fight on the battlefield. We have to win the argument as well.
Right. Yeah.
So what is the ideological answer? And again, it is staring us in the face and we don't fully recognize it.
Right.
The answer is nationalism.
Right.
Today, in front of us, we have seen Daesh, for example, being defeated by Iraqi nationalism.
Right.
They are all Iraqis and the Arabs, and Syrian nationalism.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And we here understand the importance and power of nationalism that is good, nationalism that is even creative. Nationalism is different. You know, most terrorist movements actually are singular. They represent a single sect or view. But nationalism essentially is plural. The nation belongs to everyone. Across, every citizen has equal rights. So it is pluralism. It is faith equality as a civilized form of existence rather than faith supremacy. And these are the answers that we do have. You may call it modernism, you may call it anything you like.
Right.
But these are the answers that we do have, and we don't apply them enough.
Right. Excellent points, again, Mr. Minister. There was a period in the areas to the west of India where to challenge nationalism, Islamism was encouraged and embraced. In response to the appeal, for example, of Arab nationalism in the form of Nasirism or Baathism or some of the other forms, more liberal forms, that powers or entities within countries that felt threatened by that employed Islamism in a functional way to counter that. But that's only one of the reasons for this, the phenomenon that grew the rise of Islamism. The Iranian Revolution was part of its manifestation was going beyond nationalism, particularly as defined as a nation state. And still there is a question when Henry Kissinger raises this often, is Iran a nation state or is it an ideology, a revolution, that there should be no reason why we couldn't deal with and work with an Iran that behaves as a nation state, but Iran that behaves as a revolution. It's much harder to work with. You have to rely on other instruments in dealing with that. And in the current debate, in places that have been powerful forces in promoting Islamism, whether Sunni or Shia, you see this discussion that has happened, as I mentioned, is happening in Iran. We'll see how it goes, and you see it in the reforms in Saudi Arabia as well. But the problem of terrorism that the previous panel here did a very good job, I thought, of discussing it, is that it's in part state-sponsored. I mean, there's no question that states like Pakistan and Iran sponsor groups that are terrorist groups. There are financial the groups that provide and countries that provide financial support. There is policies and circumstances, ideologies that affect its growth. But I believe that while territorially things are better now in Syria and Iraq, with regard to the current premier group of terrorists, Daesh, which was the son of the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which itself had its other origins, forefathers, and they may have their children and grandchildren, that as an ideology, however, territorially it has been devastated, but as an ideology, it's there, and there are conditions under which they will grow, and the conditions under which they will not. And it's not only near-term tactical issues, but there are longer-term underlying factors that will have to be addressed. But at the very high level, the consolidation of nation states, embracing of modernization, are two of the basic issues that are required. Also, at some point, copying or borrowing from the history of Europe, the Westphalian model, and I agree with your analysis, in the Middle East, the broader Middle East, there is some requirement over time for stabilization, for mutual acceptance of both Shiism and Sunni Islam as equally valid versions of Islam. They're here. And two, some understanding between the major players, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, on some rules of the game. Some think this could happen after 30, 40 years, additional areas of conflict. I don't have such a confidence myself how long it will take to get there, that you need some balance of power issues that to deal with.
It just occurred to me that that region has been searching for rules since the time of Justinian.
Exactly. So one can't
quite managed to.
Exactly right.
You mentioned Dr. Kissinger.
Yeah.
And you again confirmed an old suspicion of mine. I admire him greatly.
Yeah.
That his questions are always far more interesting than his answers.
Yeah. I have high regards for him.
But the very fact that he provokes them is extremely important.
And that he can still do that.
He can still do that, absolutely. Yes, I find it a great joy.
Yeah.
But this is perhaps the appropriate moment to look at another direction. And the whole Kissinger analysis, of course, is very European.
Right.
And very even Westphalian.
Right.
Which is that it hinges upon the concept of balance of power.
Right.
And measures power and then seeks balances which do not have a history of survival for too long. Would you agree that in this commitment to the balance of power, we have somewhere lost out on the power of balance in the management of world affairs?
Yes.
What would be your thoughts on that?
Well, you and I had this conversation, I think.
Well, let's share it. We make it public knowledge.
Yeah, a year ago. I think both are powerful. I am not yet in a place to say that the balance of power is not important. I think it is important, but I think
I merely suggested that we can't
Yeah.
lose sight of either.
I agree with that, and I think that when you have balance, it has powerful implications.
One of the most important, if again
Yeah.
slightly subterranean in that
Yeah.
sense, facts about my country's
Sure.
foreign policy, is this extraordinary ability that India has shown, particularly now,
Right.
to work across binaries.
Yes.
We have friendships, we have extremely good relations with countries that within their regions may not necessarily see eye to eye
Absolutely.
with each other. But we have extremely good relations with both.
Right.
And our capacity to develop bridges and partnerships
It's,
across parallel streams,
right.
again, is absolutely an extension
Absolutely.
of our commitment that we, as I put it somewhere, is that when we say that we have a defense force,
Right.
we actually mean that we have a defense force.
Right.
I mean, we don't have an offense force.
Right.
There is no history of aggression
Right.
against any country.
Right.
On the other hand, we understand the meaning of defense. That means not a single inch of territory and not a single Indian citizen shall be hurt without
Right.
accountability.
Absolutely.
And, but how do you, to just shift the arc a little,
Yes.
how do you see the next 5-10 years in Afghanistan?
I want to say a word on this balance and India's role, which I think is extremely important because once you have self-confidence and you have a balance, then that provides you a basis for a broad engagement. And India, in my judgment, is extremely important, its role and its growing strength is and interest certainly of my country, the United States, but also of, I think, Asia, that there be a balance in which India plays a vital role and that it sort of, from that, it engages very broadly, that there will be resistance towards hegemony based on a balance and broad political engagement. Because there are powers that are seeking hegemony in the region. So India has its own unique instruments, and one of the things that I've been impressed is the role in the world that we're increasingly going to the sort of digital world, digitized world. And I know that models such as the Aadhaar has its own issues in India, but provide promising options for as India plays a bigger role, how that the digitization as part of an inclusive economic development model to address the needs of the populations in many developing countries, there could be lessons to be learned and role that India can play. Now, with regard to Afghanistan, which is has been close to my heart, is that I think it's a contingent future, the next 5 years, a contingent future on our commitment, global, international commitment led by the United States. India is a great partner in that regard. It's contingent on the effective implementation of the new American strategy, which I support, which at its core has the idea that Pakistan must change its policy, that success absolutely depends on that, bringing about that change, and the continuing effort to build Afghan institutions, particularly its security institutions, but also its economic potential, so it becomes more self-reliant, and managing the complex Afghan politics. Elections are coming, parliamentary elections this year, presidential election next year, and how the process of state building with different power centers, how that is, which is a delicate balancing act, reform, institution building plus inclusiveness is managed well. So I think, assuming if we were to do a partial equilibrium analysis, hold something constant, change something else, we could get different outcomes. But I remain, was more pessimistic a year and a half ago than I am now, and I think with the new strategy, I mean, Afghanistan is a very different place than it was 16 years ago. A lot of people think, well, nothing has happened.
A great deal
but
has
it is a very different place.
A great deal has happened, and we can't afford to either forget or abandon.
Right, I agree with that.
What has happened, although I know contingent is such a diplomatic word. In fact, you began by saying that the Trump administration is now ready to call a spade a spade.
Yes.
While that is welcome because we've heard rhetoric before.
Right.
Are you sure that you're calling a detonator a mere spade?
Well, my judgment is that there is great determination. There is great determination to follow through. Of course, some people are saying we could see a tweet that says something different, but no. At the institutional level, I believe that there's a great determination, because as long as we are committed to containing and defeating the threat of terrorism, and as long as we are committed to the objective that Afghanistan should not become a place from which the international community, but of course for us, the United States in particular, is not threatened by terrorists based in Afghanistan. We would risk or take huge risk if we were to abandon
the thinking community.
Yes.
The thinking community always asks a question relevant to Pakistan,
yes,
which is that one of the instruments, short of use of military means,
right,
one of the instruments that has now become pretty common practice,
right,
is the use of sanctions.
Absolutely, and I support that.
Yes.
Yes.
So why,
against individuals, for example, who are involved in sponsoring terrorism, because the goal is ultimately, and I think my conversation last year, I don't know whether the foreign secretary was sitting here, we agreed in our conversation that the objective is to change Pakistani behavior. And what are the instruments to bring that change?
Let us give specific examples of behavior.
Yes.
Behavior is that a person who has sanctions virtually applied to him,
right,
a prime minister,
right,
of a neighboring country says that there is no case against Hafez.
Right.
I mean, this is astonishing.
Absolutely.
If there is no case against somebody whose guilt is proven on television,
absolutely,
during the event itself, then is the world going to be impotent?
Yes. Well, unfortunately, your neighbor to the west has a record of denying facts at times that would be shocking if it was to take place somewhere else.
This is as brazen as it gets.
Yeah, for example, I have to say that I've dealt with this in detail in my book that I did last year. But during my tenure as ambassador to Afghanistan, I complained about a lot about the emerging sanctuary. I was there in the early years post 9/11. And one time, President Bush got tired of me raising this constantly, so he said, I will call President Musharraf and tell him that you're coming to see him. I said to the president, you don't really want that. No, he said, I do want that, because I said I may not be the best person given my public statements. So I went to see the president of Pakistan. And he was very gracious, very charming. And I said to him, Mr. President, what's your problem with this new Afghanistan? Because your friends, the Americans, are there, and we have very good relationship with the President Karzai and the Afghan leadership. If you have some issues that worry you, we can perhaps do something about them. So he raised a couple of issues which I addressed, and I said, this is what I will do with regard to them. And he was very pleased, said, nobody speaks that clearly and hasn't done that. Was very generous towards me personally. And then I said, I'm not done yet, Mr. President. I want your help with regard to the Taliban. And he said, Taliban? They are not in Pakistan. And I said, Mr. President, the leadership is called the Quetta Shura. And then there is a Peshawar Shura. And journalists go, they appear on GeoTV, some of them. And he said, this is all Indian propaganda. That is, if you think they are there, give me their phone numbers and give me their location. And I said, I'm sorry, Mr. President, that I've wasted your time. So we've had this, in all countries there is some gap between declaratory policy and sometimes actual policy. But in the case of Pakistan, I'm sorry to say, the gap is unusually wide. And sometimes you see it in the example that you said. Now, we want, obviously, a good relationship with Pakistan, but we want that this issue of terrorism in particular as among other issues, addressed kind of front and center. And if not, we need to exercise the instruments.
Ambassador, don't enough Pakistanis see that this is self-destructive? Long before they manage to hurt someone else as much as they want to, they'll have destroyed themselves. And you see the deterioration in that society and in its polity.
Well, that's true, that in terms of the domestic one, but the deep state, as a military establishment, ISI, I think the previous panel talked about it, perhaps believe that that's an instrument that can produce results in terms of their ambitions. And they have thought that they can manage the internal cost because they see the benefits to them externally. We need to make sure that they understand that that's a miscalculation. And that could only happen by what we and others do together. And I think if the external kind of perception that exists that this is paying off, this is beneficial, if that proves or is seen as being too costly, ineffective, then I think the internal costs will perhaps coerce the deep state to adjust. And I think that those costs have to be not only on the battlefield in terms of, for example, Afghans being able to defend themselves against that threat by helping to harden them against it, but also in terms of the sanctions that we discussed, in terms of exercising the right of self-defense if necessary to go after the sanctuaries where training is occurring, where arming is occurring, and in terms of other costs in terms of how Pakistan is treated.
So do you see the Trump administration raising the cost of bad behavior?
I believe that's very much part and parcel of the strategy. I think it is cooked in the strategy. And I know there are people who are saying, no, it won't work. But I believe that we haven't tried
Hard enough.
hard enough.
And the deep state is the permanent state.
It is, but there is dissatisfaction with the performance of the deep state also that's widespread. And we also, I think one other point that I want to make in this regard, which came out of an earlier discussion by the Chief of the General Staff of India, I think we all, both India and the United States and others, need to look at the linkages between narcotics, not only to finance, for purposes of financing terrorist group, but an offline source of revenue for the deep state. I think we haven't focused enough attention on sort of whether part of the effort that the war in Afghanistan sponsored by groups or carried out by groups sponsored is whether it's not about those resources. Who is involved in the kind of transportation to other global markets and what happens across the border into Pakistan and then from there abroad.
And it
very important. in my
clearly
view.
travels by a magic carpet. Its eventual destinations.
Yes.
Right.
Indeed.
And nobody sees anything in between 7,000 miles or whatever. Just to shift the angle of discussion a bit.
Yes, sir.
One of the themes of our dialogue is disruption.
Right.
And I think perhaps this is the time to make clear that when we talk of disruption, we mustn't confuse it with change agent.
Right.
Nations, societies will not survive stagnation,
Right.
right? In fact, there is nothing really in history called stagnation. You either progress or you regress.
You decay.
Or you decay. So change agents actually take their nations and the people forward towards a defined horizon.
Right.
Disruption is something that actually seeks chaos for the sake of completely non-sustainable objectives. Technology is a positive disruption.
Sure.
You can't. And one of the things that strikes me about the rise of technology as a very major presence in our lives, and sometimes the fact that we are nervous about it, is that if you look at the major developments or advances from the wheel up to electrical appliances, then broadly these new inventions have had an incremental impact on society. And the wheel hasn't changed. It may be now on an automobile rather than a bullock cart, but it is an invention as it was, right? Technology is perhaps the first invention which actually keeps reinventing itself. And we do not quite know where this reinvention will pause or stop. And that it raises extreme levels of both excitement and doubt and worry about what its impact would be. We can see it being used by those who should be using it. We see the enormous impact and positive impact that it can make on one of the most important and perhaps radical thoughts of our Prime Minister Narendra Modi's economic policies is the use of technology and the use of gender reform as central to the poverty elimination programs.
Absolutely.
And he's linked the two extremely, extremely creatively. by empowering women, making them, the
Yes.
poorest women, technology sensitive,
Right, absolutely.
making them owners, making them participants in a banking system,
Right.
which they never had before, and so on.
Yeah.
So how much more time do we have? Oh, I thought it was 12:30. I thought we had till 12:30, but it's such a relief to know time's up. We were really pushing the envelope. Our IQ is exhausted. So, thank you very much. the
Yours is
sponsor.
not, for sure.
But, well, we leave technology to some other session.
Yeah.
And thank you all. But if you have any last thoughts on the subject.
Well, on this issue, I think technology has many positive things, and it's going to continue, obviously. And I think the Indian example of what it has been able to do can be, as I said before, lessons can be learned from in other countries that face their own or similar problems. That's the positive side. And there are other positive things. But there is obviously, as you said, negative sides, particularly that the issues of disruption. There is some disruption capability. We are moving from, in addition to the weapons of mass destruction that we have been focused on, information technologies, the netting that is taking place, vulnerabilities that are created by this, and that where we have to cooperate to deal with is toward mass disruption. And the use of these technologies to undermine legitimacy, to undermine stability, and to be used in conflict or prior to conflict. So we need to focus more on the mass disruption part, the potential that is also have become available with this new technologies that we are benefiting from on the most part. But I thank you for your kindness.
You all very much
Thank you.
for your patience, and we look forward to the rest of the dialogue.